please welcome to the stage Executive Vice President of Business Coaching and Consulting, Kirk Hewlett.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Alamo City of San Antonio, Texas, and your ConnectEd National Education and Networking Conference. So, hello to all of you here in the Gonzalez Convention Center and to all of you joining us virtually from across the United States. So we are so thrilled to be here in San Antonio, which is our nation's 7th largest city. We're here for our annual gathering, so excited, and there's a lot of reasons to be excited about San Antonio. First, this city has a rich history. It was founded over 300 years ago as a Spanish mission. San Antonio is the only U.S. city to have 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the Alamo and the San Antonio Missions Historical Park. Now, we're here also because San Antonio is very much an innovative city. In 1928, a 21-story building was built. The Milam Building was built here in downtown San Antonio, not far from here, and it became the first air-conditioned high-rise in the United States. The builders promoted it as having manufactured weather. So this prototype air conditioning system kept temperatures inside the building at a comfortable 80 degrees. Does that seem a little warm to you? Well, let me help you out here. That's almost twice the 48 degrees you're going to find in the meeting rooms here in the Gonzalez Convention Center. So wear layers. Now, for more modern innovation, look to the Bexar County Bibliothek, which is located here in San Antonio. Now, this is the first public library in the whole country to offer an exclusively digital collection. And it's still the only one to do so after all these years. The bibliothek is actually so futuristic, the librarian sends you text to shush you. Now, we're also here because San Antonio is a beautiful city. My recommendation, one evening after the sun goes down, go take a leisurely stroll around the Riverwalk. The lighted bridges, the boats, the boats cruising on the waterway, the lanterns, the baskets of flowers reflecting in the river. It's really unique. It's just beautiful. You're not going to find it anywhere else in the country. And you can also go beyond the city limits and enjoy the Texas Hill Country. You can enjoy scenic wooded state parks and hiking paths. There's historical sites out in the hill country as well, like LBJ's Ranch is out there, which is a National Historic Monument. You can also go out and visit Matthew McConaughey's birthplace in the hill country, which is not yet a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but I predict someday it will be. Now, whether you're joining us in person here or virtually, we're so excited to connect with you over the next 3 days. Between now and Friday, you're going to hear a variety of keynote speakers. You're going to hear from our executive team. You're going to hear from your peers. Tomorrow's segment will begin with a fireside chat with Jamie Price, followed by a look at industry trends driving Advisor Group strategy with Greg Cornick. And from there, we're going to focus on Advisor Group and how it's working on building an enhanced advisor experience. Then on Friday, we're going to discuss how you can enhance your clients' experiences. We'll be joined by Phil Blancato, Kristen Kimmel, yours truly, and several other subject matter experts. So a couple of things to do to prepare yourself and make the most out of ConnectEd. Be sure to download the mobile event app to keep a pulse on everything happening at ConnectEd, to get notifications of what's going on, and to create your personalized agenda. Now, we programmed this event to offer multiple opportunities for active engagement. Now, here's some of the ways you can make the most of your ConnectEd experience. First, it's all about the marketplace. This is your central location to gather, network, and engage with your peers, strategic partners, vendors, and our home office staff and experts. Now, they're here to connect with you, to support your business, and answer any questions that you have. And if you need additional time with our team, you can register for a one-on-one expert consultation or sit down with the executives in the Executive Connect area, or just grab an employee, sit down, have a great conversation, any of the conversation nooks throughout the convention center. And the marketplace is also where you can participate in breakout discussions. You can see the future of advisor group technology. You can attend 20-minute spotlight sessions on our spotlight session stages. And of course, support 2 local charities. The first is Soldiers Angels. Now, this is a local nonprofit that supports the military men and women who are bravely serving our country. Now, San Antonio is also known as Military City, USA, because it has one of the largest concentrations of military bases in the United States. To help support, yeah, a round of applause is very appropriate there. So to help support Soldiers Angels and its very important mission, we're going to be assembling flyaway bags for service members who are being deployed to combat zones. Sponsored by our partners BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, and PIMCO, these hygiene kits have toothpaste, toothbrush, snacks, water, and more. So join us outside the marketplace following tonight's general session to show your support for this worthy cause. Now, after you assemble those flyaway bags, head on over to our Canine Corral. This is where you can play with puppies. Yeah, really, you get to play with puppies. Those are from another important local nonprofit, San Antonio Pets Alive. This is sponsored by our partner, The Standard. So visit the corral, get your puppy on. You're going to help them find loving homes, maybe your loving home. You can take one home with you if you like. It'll go under the seat on the plane. So the corral is going to be open following tonight's general session near booth number 1. All right, next. We're excited to hear from best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell, who will be giving our keynote address. And that will be followed by a Q&A session with Advisor Group's Kristen Kimmel. Malcolm Gladwell is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, What the Dog Saw, and David and Goliath. Additionally, he has one of the most popular podcasts available today. It's called Revisionist History, and it re-examines something from the past, an event, a person, idea, a song, and asks whether we got it right the first time. Malcolm Gladwell has also been recognized on the Time Magazine 100 Most Influential Person list and touted on Foreign Policy Magazine's Top Global Thinkers list. Now, as a reminder, please no recording of any kind during this session. So without further ado, please welcome to the ConnectEd stage, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to see all of you. I'm very glad we're not doing this on Zoom, which would not be nearly as exciting. It's also very exciting to be in a state with no income tax. Those of you who are from New York know what I'm talking about, and you know that moment when you land and you do that, start doing the math in your head about how much more money you'd have if you lived here. So, does it count if I'm here for like 3 days? Do I get to take 3 days off my New York City? Anyway, that's a question I'm sure you guys can answer. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I thought what I would do this evening is to talk about trust, because I think a real simple way, the simplest way to explain the business that all of you are in is that you're in the trust business, right? That's the most elegant explanation of the function that you serve. But I wonder sometimes whether we don't take that word trust for granted. So what I thought I'd do is simply talk about where trust comes from, how we build trust, and sort of try and dissect that term and help us all come to a better understanding of why it's so important. And I think that's a really crucial conversation to have right now, because one of the overwhelming facts about the world that we live in right now is that we have a crisis of trust in our society, right? I don't think anybody disputes that fact. The Gallup organization has been taking polls of Americans over the last, I think, 75 or so years, and every year you see a decline in the level of public trust in the major institutions in our society, and that ought to concern all of us. So I think this is a really important conversation, not just for your profession, but for the country as a whole. One small caveat before I start. I will be making only fleeting references to your business during this talk. I'm not going to talk much about the markets or the economy or anything, because I have a rule that I always hold to, which is that I never talk about things that my audience knows more about than I do. I learned this lesson. This is a digression. I love digressions, as you'll discover. I learned this lesson the hard way. A couple years ago, I was asked to give a talk at Rockefeller University, which is this sort of obscure but incredibly prestigious high-end graduate school in Manhattan, which it's like only the most brilliant students in the world go there, and half of the staff has Nobel Prizes. And they had this public lecture series that they started, which was basically they would bring in lambs for the slaughter, and I was one of the lambs. And I don't know why, because I'm an idiot, halfway through my talk, I made reference to some missile system from the 1970s. At the end of the talk, this little white-haired guy in the front row still has the German accent. They all have German accents. It raises his hand and he goes, "With respect to your discussion of the SS-21 missile, you are 100% incorrect. How do I know this? I designed the missile." So you never really recover from a situation like that. So I'm not going anywhere near your world this evening. So just bear that in mind. I will talk a fair amount about medicine, and that's for a reason, though, because I think the medical world and the issues the medical world is facing right now are very similar to the issues in your world. That's also a trust-driven business in many respects. And I think it's an appropriate analogy, a useful analogy for examining the importance of this particular word. So I want to make three arguments about trust. And the first one is a very simple argument, and that is that trust has never been more important than it is today. Now, that's almost a cliche. I'm sure you've heard that, but I think it's worth digging into the reasons why. Why is it that the 21st century world or the 21st century economy is trust-centered in a way that the previous worlds were not? And I said I would use examples for medicine, so let me give you an example it's a little bit grisly, and I apologize for that, but it is of enormous relevance to those of us in the room, like myself, who are middle-aged men. 50 years ago, if you were a man in his 50s, like me, and you had pain in your hips and spine, and you had blood in your urine, you would go and see a urologist, and the urologist would give you a rectal exam, and if he found I told you this was going to be a little bit grisly. Just bear with me. This is all going to have a point in the end. I shouldn't point when I'm talking about a rectal exam. The urologist gives you a rectal exam, and if he finds a lump on your prostate, he says, "You have cancer. We're going to take your prostate out." Right? A relatively straightforward procedure. You come in with a problem, the urologist gathers information, he makes a diagnosis, and then he acts. Now, compare that to the way we deal with this problem today. Today, you don't wait to have pain in your hips and spine. Today, it is recommended that men over the age of 40 or 50 have a regular exam for what's called a PSA test, where we measure the presence of a particular antigen that is known to be associated with an enlarged prostate. And we have a scale of 0 to whatever, and if your PSA test is above 4, we say it's problematic, and we do a biopsy. We take your prostate and we take 6 little slivers from it, and we examine them under a microscope, and if the cells look like they're unusual or problematic, then we recommend some course of action, whether that's, surgery, chemo, radiation therapy, or doing nothing, or inaction, right? That is a completely different way of attacking that problem, right? At every step in the way, it's more complicated. I mean, that PSA scale of 0 to whatever it is, 100, we've decided that 4 is the number that gets us concerned. How did we choose 4 as the magic number? There's no hard and fast reason. We just figured 4 is the... Would you find lots of cancer if you made the cutoff 3? Yes, you would. Why do we take 6 slices of the prostate? Would we find more cancer if we took 12 slices? Yeah, we would. Should we lower the PSA score and do 12 slices? Sure, we'll find more cancer, but that's also problematic because most prostate cancer won't kill you. It moves so slowly that, if you just leave it alone, it'll never bother you, right? So we know that if we find more cancer, we're probably going to end up treating lots of men for a disease that would never actually do them any harm. And the treatment for prostate cancer is really nasty, right? Now, think about how that complexity that I've just described changes not just the role of the urologist, but the kind of relationship the urologist has to have with the patient. In the previous generation, the urologist was a collector of information, right? That's all they did, gathered data and acted. Now they have to be an analyst of information. They have to look at all of these confusing data points, the PSA score, the biopsies, the number of slices, the numerous options about what to do, and they have to make sense of it, right? And more than that, they have to be able to talk to you about it. In the previous generation, the urologist was there, the doctor was there to give you an answer. And now there's no answer. Now the doctor is there just to give you, the best that doctor can do is give you guidance, is to give you insight. And that is a very, very different kind of discussion, right? So every man is going to have a different reaction to the risks and benefits of dealing with prostate. The rule of thumb with prostate cancer is your risk of having prostate cancer is your age. I'm 59. I have a 59% chance of having prostate cancer. Now, when I look at all of the chances of, the side effects of treatment and the number of men who are treated for a disease that would never kill them, I say, you know what? It's not worth it. I'm not going to get my PSA test. That's actually a rational position that many men take. It is also the case that many men look at that same risk profile and say, I want to have a PSA test not just tomorrow, but every year. That is also a rational position, right? If you are a urologist, you have to be able to have a different conversation with every one of your patients based on your understanding of what that patient wants, what they need, what their risk assessment is, how much fear they carry around with them, how they want to live their lives, right? And all of those conversations require one thing. They require trust. Right? You can't have that conversation with your patient if your patient doesn't trust you. Right? A generation ago, the urologist didn't need to have the trust of his patient. He was just going in and doing a transaction. He was saying, it's got to come out. I mean, what do you do in that situation? You say, okay. But now we're not having that kind of simplistic thing. Now we're engaged in this much more complex, emotionally important, essential conversation, and it doesn't work unless there is a bond between the professional and the client, right? Now, I think this is true not just in the world of prostate cancer, but it's true across every single profession in the modern world. As we increase the complexity of the information that a professional is dealing with, then the need for trust in that professional's relationship with his or her client grows accordingly, right? The more complexity, the more trust is necessary. And this is absolutely the case in your profession. I mean, back in the 1960s, how hard was it to be a financial advisor? You bought some GM, you bought some AT&T, you bought some GE, you bought some IBM, and if you were feeling kind of frisky, you bought some Xerox, right? And the American economy was so strong, and it grew every year, and America was the dominant economy in the world, and things looked so wonderful and rosy and optimistic that that was actually a pretty good strategy. Now, compare the world we live in now to the world of 1965. I mean, it's an order of magnitude more complicated. And you're dealing with a body of clients who are an order of magnitude more complicated. In the past, you're dealing with, one person who probably has first-generation wealth. Now you're dealing with second-generation wealth and third-generation wealth. Does the 85-year-old grandfather who made the fortune think about his money in a different way than his 25-year-old granddaughter or grandson? Absolutely, right? Of necessity. They're in different places in their lives. They belong to different generations. And that means that the kinds and complexity of conversations you have to have grown extraordinarily in importance and complexity over the last 2 generations, right? It's a different world. There's a wonderful paradigm that the intelligence analyst Gregory Treverton came up with some years ago, and he divided problems into what he called mysteries and puzzles. And he said a puzzle is a problem that's caused by a lack of information. And he would say, if you think back to the CIA during the Cold War, most of their problems were puzzles. They wanted to know things about the Soviet Union that were solved with, that could be solved by just by getting more information, right? It was a closed society. We didn't know how many bombs they had. We didn't know how big their economy was. We didn't know what their intentions were. We didn't know all these things. And to the extent we could find bits of information, we could resolve those problems. That's a world of puzzles. And then Treverton says there's a class of problems called mysteries. And mysteries are problems where you have too much information, where you're overwhelmed with data, and where the challenge that faces you is making sense of that data, right? And Treverton says the modern world is a place of mysteries, not puzzles. The issue we have now is not too little information, but too much. And how do you make sense of too much information, right? You turn to people who you trust. There's a famous moment after 9/11 where a guy named Admiral Inman, Bobby Inman, who used to head the NSA, was asked in front of a group of congressional committee that was trying to figure out how to respond to 9/11. And they asked this guy, who had been in the American intelligence establishment his entire life, what do you need to prevent another 9/11 from happening again? And they thought he was going to say, give me $50 billion, give me 1,000 more spies, give me satellites. And he said, rebuild the State Department. And what he meant was, I need more people I can trust, who know the culture of the enemy, who can work with me to make sense of this mound of data that we have, who have judgment, who have thoughtfulness, who have historical perspective, right? That's what he wanted, because he understood that he was operating in a mystery universe and not a puzzle universe. So that's my first question for all of you, that this same transition has happened in your world. That's what we're talking about. We're moving from puzzles to mysteries. Are you prepared to make that transition? Right? Have you accepted the fact that the way in which you relate to information and your client today is fundamentally different than it was a generation ago? That is not a trivial transition. I could point to you to institutions across this country that are still operating as if we're trapped in a puzzle world, who haven't understood that a world in which there is too much information is profoundly different in the way we make sense of it than a world in which there is too little. Okay. Second lesson about trust. Where does trust come from? Now, I think most of us, if we were asked to answer that question, we would say, well, trust is something that you earn through performance. When you're someone who does a really good job for your customer or your client or your patient over the years, you earn their trust, right? Now, that seems to make a lot of sense. But if you look at real-world situations of trust, you see that that doesn't seem the way it works at all, right? So let me give you a couple examples. It is absolutely the case that the quality of American policing is higher today than it was 60 years ago, 70 years ago. There is no one in the world of law enforcement who would dispute that fact. Police officers are better trained today. They are more professional. There was way less corruption. They do a better job of preventing crimes, of tracking crimes, on every dimension. Law enforcement in this country is better today than it was in, say, the 1960s. It's funny, I've been doing this book on Los Angeles in the 1940s and 50s, and a lot of it is a discussion of the LAPD. And man, policing was bad in the 1940s. I mean, it is staggering, right? So you would think that as a consequence of this improvement in the performance of policing, that over the last 50 years, the faith, the trust that the American public has in law enforcement would have grown. Wrong. It's gone like that. It's plummeted, right? Same thing with medicine. If you compare medicine of today to medicine of 60 years ago, there's just no question that it's way, way better. I mean, the list of diseases that were death sentences in 1950, and today we treat like that, and you walk out of the hospital, is as long as my arm. I mean, there is no comparison to the way the sophistication and the performance of the medical community today than 50 years ago. You know what the trust numbers were for the healthcare system 50 years ago? 80% of Americans thought had complete trust in the healthcare system. You know what those numbers are today? 40%. Their performance has gone up like that. Public trust has been halved. So clearly there isn't a connection, a clear and uncomplicated connection between how good a job you do and how much trust the public or your clients have in the work you do. Trust seems to be based on something else. Right? What is it? Well, let me tell you, I think, a really useful story about this that I think helps us get to the core of that. It's a story about the Marine Corps and Wake Island. At the Wake Island, the beginning of the Second World War, the Marine Corps had a base on Wake Island. Wake Island is a little tiny island midway between Hawaii and Japan. It's just like 12 miles long. But it was enormously significant because it was where you had to stop for refueling if you were flying across the North Pacific. Hugely important strategically in the Second World War. And the same day the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, they attack Wake Island. And the Navy, the U.S. Navy, is so far away that they want to come and help, and they just think it's just not worth it. And the Japanese blockade Wake Island and eventually invade, and they overrun the Marine Corps base, and almost everyone on the base ends up being killed. It is this devastating moment in the Second World War, not because this was the biggest or most consequential battle, but psychologically it was the first U.S. territory that was lost in the Second World War. So it was coming on at the same time as Pearl Harbor. You can't imagine how much this was in the news. And it was doubly humiliating for the Marine Corps. Because you have to understand, the Marine Corps in 1941 was the most troubled and least trusted branch of the American military. It had been there on 6 occasions, I think in the previous 50 years, Congress had tried to shut the Marine Corps down. People thought of it as a bunch of rowdy, ill-disciplined soldiers who had no particular strategic or tactical function. They were tiny, they didn't have a seat on the Joint Chiefs, they had no real equipment to speak of. They were, at the beginning of the Second World War, 90% of young American men being recruited into the military put the Marine Corps last on the places they would like to serve, right? And if I asked you in 1941, which of the branches of the military will not survive the Second World War, every one of you would have said the Marine Corps, right? That's how desperate their straits were. So what happens over the course of the Second World War? Exactly the opposite. It's the Marine Corps that comes out with the strongest reputation. It's the Marine Corps that becomes the most trusted branch of the American military. It's actually the Army that takes the biggest hit. We forget this now, but the Army emerged from the Second World War as a bruised and battered institution. It was the Marine Corps that was up there front and center. Now, why did the Marine Corps manage this extraordinary transformation in the eyes of the American public? Is it because they were better fighters over the course of the war? Did they distinguish themselves in battle in the way that the Army soldiers did not, or the Navy did not? No. Everybody fought really hard in the Second World War. It wasn't about performance. It was the way in which the Marine Corps began to talk about who they were and what they stood for. They began to speak the language of values in a way that no other branch of the military did. So they took the central fact about who they were, which is they were a group of young, rowdy men, right? I've forgotten the exact number, but some incredible percentage of Marine Corps recruits in the Second World War had a criminal record. I mean, it really was a bunch of hoodlums. And as opposed to denying this, they said, you know what? We're going to own it. They said, yeah, we're really rowdy, and yeah, we come from all kinds of kind of dissolute backgrounds, but that makes us tough. Way tougher and more courageous than anybody else, right? And they began to talk, even more importantly, about their connection to family. They were the only branch of the military that said, we are fighting this war in order to protect our families back home. They said that message over and over again and explicitly. You know, it's fascinating. We're getting into the weeds here, but if you were in the Second World War, if you were a journalist and you wanted to report on what the Army was doing, you would accompany some Army unit into battle, and you'd write about what the general said and how the battle went and all this. If you wanted to do that with the Marine Corps said, first of all, you've got to join the Marine Corps. Can't be just tagging along. And secondly, we don't want you to write about what the generals said or what the course of the action of the war or the battle took or anything. We want you to write about the Marines themselves, the kids. Talk about how they're feeling it, how they're doing, and how much they miss their families. And I want you to go back and I want you to publish those stories in their hometown papers. And I want you to call up their families and tell their families what's going on with their sons who are on the front lines of the battle. That made an enormous difference in people's perception of that institution. And after the war, what does the Marine Corps do? They start Toys for Tots, right? Which is still a big deal today. In the 50s, that was a huge deal. That was a deliberate attempt by the Marine Corps to say, this is what we're about. We're about getting toys to kids in families who don't have toys, right? That's why we fight, to do that kind of thing. Even today, you can see the difference in the messaging of the force services, right? The Army says, we'll teach you something that'll be really useful when you leave the Army. You notice that? It's all about like, you're going to say goodbye to us. Okay, we've accepted that fact. We'll just make sure you have a bunch of skills to take with you. The Navy says, basically a travel brochure. You can see the war. And the Air Force says, you can play like really cool video games on Uncle Sam's time, right? They're all talking about something else, right? What does the Marine Corps do? It's the dude with a sword. The few, the proud, the chosen. They're talking about values. And that's not an accident, because they understand that that is the way to communicate who they are and what they stand for. And that is the way to build trust, not by performance. They don't say we fight wars better than everybody else. They say we stand for something that other people do not, right? Now, think about this in terms of your own profession, right? The temptation, when you talk about winning the trust of your customers, your clients, the temptation is to talk in terms of performance. Look at what I have done with the portfolios of my clients over the years. Look at how I have performed relative to the market, right? And we do that because we think that is the surest path to building the trust and loyalty of our client base. But that's not true, right? I mean, it's part of the story. It matters that you do a good job handling the money of the people who want you to handle their money. But that's not what wins the trust of your clients in the long term, right? You are charged with doing something of unparalleled importance in the lives of your clients, right? You're in charge of their peace of mind. If you do your job right, they sleep at night. That's an unbelievably important responsibility in the world, right? And the way to win that kind of trust, to help your client sleep at night, is to talk in terms of values, is to do more than simply talk in terms of performance. If you look at the medical community and look into the reasons about why their levels of public trust have been cut in half over the last 50 years, it's because of this. It's because all they do is talk about performance, and they don't talk about values. When was the last time your doctor took you by the hand and said, I care about you? Right? When did that happen? I'm here not just to give you pills or operate on you or put you through this long, complicated system. I'm here because I care about you. If they talked with that kind of language, they wouldn't be facing a 50% drop in levels of trust over the course of 2 generations. So, second question. Do you talk enough about values? Do you speak that kind of language? Or are you talking exclusively in terms of performance? Third lesson. Trust is a conversation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's a story I tell in my book, Blink, which, if you've not read it, you should all purchase it in triplicate. I mean, why not get more than one copy? But I tell the story, and I've thought about it many times since. It's the story of the Aeron chair. Now, many of you, I'm sure, sit on an Aeron chair, or at least you sit on a chair that was inspired by the Aeron chair. It's the original mesh chair. You know, old generation chairs had all this thick padding, and then in the 90s, Herman Miller comes out with this newfangled kind of chair which looks really kind of flimsy and just has this mesh with all this kind of holes in it, and this is their reinvention of the office chair. And when they first roll it out, you know, they do these focus groups with facilities managers, the people who will be buying the chair in bulk. But they need to impress facilities managers in order to make the product a success. And they roll it out and they show it to all these people. And normally you have everyone grade the chair on a scale of 1 to 10. And the rule of thumb in the furniture world is you need to have a 7.5 to go to market. And they get a 2 for the Aeron chair. And they're like, oh my God, we just sunk millions of dollars in this. And there's some people within Herman Miller who are just going to say, you know what, let's just walk away. But they figured, oh, you know, we've come this far, whatever, let's just try. And they put it on the market, and in the beginning it doesn't do much, and then it builds and builds and builds and builds. And by 2010, it's the most popular chair in the country. And it's probably earned, I was trying to figure out how much money it's earned for Herman Miller. It's in the many, many, many billions of dollars. It's one of the most iconic products of the last, in the furniture business of the last 50 years. And the question is, why then did all of those facilities managers give the chairs such low marks when they first saw it? Were they naive? Were they unsophisticated? Were they lying? It says no, none of those things. The answer is that when we encounter something radically new or different, it takes a little while to warm up to it. Trust is not something that happens instantaneously. Trust is something that happens over time after an interaction with this new and radical thing that's in our lives. Right? The guy who developed the chair told me, and it's worth quoting this, he said, office chairs in people's mind had a certain aesthetic. They were cushioned and upholstered. The Aeron chair, of course, isn't. It looked different. There was nothing familiar about it. Maybe the word ugly was just a proxy for different. Now, this turns out to be a phenomenon that applies to much more than chairs. There's a truism in Hollywood that when you do market testing on a new show and you take it to focus group it with a test audience and you get a really, really low score, it can mean one of two things. It either means that your show is terrible, right? And people are like, legit, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. Or it means your show is so good, so revolutionary, so like weird and wonderful and different and strange and out of the box that people don't know what to make of it, right? And so they give it a low score. So if you look, it's fascinating, if you look at all of the greatest sitcoms and TV shows in history, an incredible percentage of them had terrible test scores when they first came on when the pilots were shown to a test audience. So All in the Family was those of you old enough to remember, like me, All in the Family. The test audiences hated it so much that CBS gave a note to the show's creators to make Archie Bunker warm and nurturing. Mary Tyler Moore Show, denounced by test audiences. They're like, who wants to watch a show about a single mom in the workforce? She should be at home. This is crazy, right? Terrible scores. Cheers. Cheers would make billions of dollars for NBC. It was the lowest rated comedy on television in its first year. Hill Street Blues was a disaster. I mean, it reinvents the whole genre of the cop show. Was a disaster. ER, remember the first episode of ER? George Clooney gets drunk, remember? People hated that show at the beginning. They're like, you have a doctor getting drunk? Are you kidding me? You want me to watch this? Seinfeld, the greatest, most commercially successful, it might be the most commercially successful television show of all time, had a disastrous first season. It was nearly canceled. The Sopranos, the second most popular HBO show of all time, was a disaster in the beginning. I mean, I could go on. This is like, it's sort of extraordinary. What we're talking about here is trust, right? When people see something that's really different and weird, they don't trust it at first. People saw the Aeron chair, and it didn't seem to them like it was going to be comfortable. They needed time to figure that out. People watched an episode in the first season of Seinfeld, and they didn't trust that they were going to enjoy it. It was like weird. It's like weirdos in an apartment in Manhattan. Why? What's happening here, right? In both those cases, it takes time for people to work through their feelings. But more importantly, though, for them to gain trust in this new and radical thing, they need to have conversations with people around them, with other listeners, with other viewers, with the people who are creating this new product. And that takes time. You know, I did an episode of my podcast, Revisionist History, which you should all listen to. It's really good, apparently. I did an episode this year on the fight against goiter in the United States 100 years ago. You know, we've all forgotten this now, but 100 years ago in this country, in certain parts of the country, Great Lakes region and upper Northwest, goiter was a real problem. You know, goiters are these massive growths on people's necks, size of grapefruits. If you went to like Cleveland or Boise, Idaho in 1900 and walked around, you would see lots and lots of people with these massive things on their neck. And they're caused by a lack of iodine in the diet, right? And there's all kinds of consequences. If you don't have enough iodine, your brain doesn't develop properly, your IQ is much lower, it's associated with all kinds of cognitive dysfunctions. The goiter was one of the most serious American public health problems at the turn of the century. And they do a series of experiments in Akron, Ohio in the 20s, and they show that if you put iodine in salt, the goiters will all go away, and the problem will vanish. Really simple. You just have to iodize salt, and we're done. And so all the public health community, not all of them, the people who did those experiments were like, great, we've just accomplished something incredible. But the rest of the country was like, no. Are you crazy? We don't want iodine in our salt. What are you doing to our salt? The FDA was so alarmed by iodine, they made the manufacturers put a skull and crossbones on their packaging. There's this wonderful history of the introduction of iodine. I'm going to read to you this description of how people behaved. You'll understand why in a moment. Here and elsewhere, the public reacted. The determined minority, as usual, made itself heard. Christian Scientists and the American Medical League inveighed against this poison. So did Dr. William Henry Hay of Buffalo, inventor of the sun diet system of therapy, which bypassed overknowledge of body physiology and alleged a cure for any disease. The home brewing fraternity, then numerous, complained that iodized water prevented the development of a decent head on beer. Protests ranged from "iodine is making me sick" to arguments against the invasion of personal privacy and liberties. Sounds a little familiar. There's a poll of public health officials in 1927 in the U.S. about whether they're willing to go along with this plan to put iodine in salt, and over 50% of them say no, right? And imagine if you were one of the people who had shown that just by putting a little bit of iodine in salt, you could cure this massive public health problem. You're tearing out your hair at that point, right? You're saying mankind has lived with the consequences of iodine deficiency for thousands and thousands of years. We finally solved it, and we cannot convince all these knuckleheads around the country to let us put iodine in their salt, right? You would say, is there something wrong with America? Well, no. There's nothing wrong with America. It's just that people are reacted to iodine the same way they react to anything that's new and different and revolutionary. The same way they reacted to Seinfeld or The Sopranos or All in the Family or The Air Chair, right? They take a little time to get used to it. They need to have a conversation before they can develop some kind of trust in this new idea. You know, I had the same, I think exactly the same thing was happening in this country during COVID with our discussion about vaccines. And I'm not, by the way, taking sides in this or meaning to wade into any kind of controversy, but the one thing that drove me crazy was the discussion that there is a group of people who are pro-vax and a group of people who are anti-vax. That's not what it was all about. There's this wonderful study that was done by a group called the Sergo Foundation, where they sat down with thousands of Americans in the middle of the pandemic and just talked about their feelings about the COVID vaccine, which was then quite new. And what they discovered was there's 40% of Americans who were like, sign me up, I'll do it tomorrow. There were 20% who they called the watchful. These are people who said, I don't know, this thing's new, it's something we've not tried before, it's a brand new technology, I want to wait and see, right? Come talk to me in 6 months. Then there was about 15% who they called the cost anxious. These are people that got 2 jobs, they don't have a lot of time, their assumption or their experience with the medical system is just the minute you walk through a doctor's door, you're out $300. They don't really know that this thing is free. They've heard that some people have side effects that cause them to miss a day of work, and they can't afford to miss a day of work. So like, you know what? I can't deal with this right now. And then there's another 15% who are the system distrusters, or actually 10%. And these are people who, they don't have health insurance, maybe they're illegal immigrants, they haven't seen a doctor in years. It's not even on their radar screen to go and get a COVID vaccine. And then there's the skeptics, the hardcore skeptics, and that's like 15% of the population who just don't buy any part of that argument, right? Now, you can't lump all of those people together, and nor can you say that there's a hard and fast difference between the people who trust this thing and people who don't trust this thing. What you have is a group of Americans, all of whom have fundamentally different responses to this new idea. And each of them needs a different kind of conversation to regain their trust in the system. The people who are watchful, who want to wait and see, just need a little patience. The people who think this is going to cost a lot of money, they need education. They need to be told, actually, it's free. The people who are distrustful or outside the system, they need a little love. They need to be introduced to the healthcare system, right? We need to find a way to bring them in the fold. And the people who are skeptical need some respect, right? You're allowed to have an opinion about what you put in your body in this country. You shouldn't be laughed at if that's your decision, like the decision that you make. That's 4 very different conversations that need to happen if we're going to regain the trust of the public in something as important and crucial as how we prepare ourselves against an epidemic disease, right? Now, think about this with respect to what all of you do. You've had a run over the last 15 years. This economy's had a run over the last 15 years that's been really kind of amazing, right? It's made the lives of anyone who handles money for a living relatively easy. I don't want to say easy, but relatively easy. We also know that those good times are about to come to an end. Things are going to get very difficult for a little period. But more than that, things are going to get different for a little period, right? And what do we know about how people handle difference? When things start to look unfamiliar, when things start to look revolutionary or radical or just outside of ordinary experience, there's a lot of what looks like fear and hostility and distrust that rises. But it's not real fear and hostility and distrust, right? It's just the normal reaction of people to something that is outside normal, right? And when people are in that kind of situation, they need a conversation. And I think that is the challenge for all of you in this room, right? Trust is going to be more important than ever in your profession, particularly in the coming months and years as things get a little rocky in our economy. And maintaining that bond with your clients, building that bond with your clients is going to require a lot more than talking and boasting about performance. It's going to be about communicating in an honest and open way with the people that you're serving. It's going to be about listening to them. It's going to be about talking about values with them. And it's going to be about showing patience when they need time to come to grips with a new and very different reality. Right? I wish you all the best in that journey. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Well, thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful, and trust and values is something that we talk about a lot in this industry, so incredibly, incredibly important for us. But I promise not to break your rule here or the next couple of questions, but I'd like to take you down a little bit of a deeper path. You talked a little bit about kind of the different parts of the reactions to the vaccine, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the pandemic. So we know the pandemic has had a significant impact on almost every aspect of our lives. But it seems like the psychological impact is something that's still a little bit unknown or maybe just not even really discussed. So I'd love for you to share with us a little bit how we should be thinking about that psychological impact in our businesses and even with our clients.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. And the most interesting observation that I've seen on this is comes from the guy who runs the Gallup polling organization. He was saying, they've been measuring how Americans assess their quality of life and their well-being for decades. And typically what you see is a bell curve, right? Small number of Americans are really unhappy. Bulk of us are in the middle. If it's a scale of 1 to 10, most of us are 5s, 6s, and 7s. There's a couple of 1s and 2s, and there's a couple of 9s and 10s. And then what he said was, over the last 10 years, and this was exacerbated during COVID, what you're seeing is the end of the bell curve. What you're seeing is way more people at the bottom who say that they're 0s and 1s, and way more people who are saying they're 9s and 10s. And this is interesting because I think it's now become, what COVID has shown is that you can't make a generalization about how people have responded to this disruption. Some people have reorganized their lives in such a way that they are profoundly happier. Think about the person who had the horrendous commute, was never seeing their parents, was, who now stays home 3 days a week, takes her kid to school, is more productive. That person's happier. That solved their problem. On the other end of the scale, think about the 20-year-old kid at a time in their life when sociability is more important than ever, who had to sit in their dorm room and take classes on Zoom for 2 years. They're really unhappy, right? And that's the reality. And so I think the task that we have to face is to figure out what can we do to move the zeros up towards the middle again? How can we fix their problem without disrupting? We don't want to make the happy people less happy. If you're a 10, let's keep you a 10. Right. Exactly. Let's not mess with the 10s. So that's way harder than a world where it's just a bell curve, where you're just kind of tinkering with the fringes, right? Mm-hmm. And that idea of this new, that picture of a new reality, I think is really a crucial one.
Do you think that, you mentioned there's more people in the 9s and 10s. Do you think that the pandemic allowed them to maybe shift their lifestyles, maybe a little more in line with some of their values? Is that something?
So if you were, I'll give you more examples. I talked about the person who now gets to spend more time with their kids and skip a commute 3 days a week, 2 days a week. But you had a lot of movement of people to communities that were sort of more in line with their values. It was an opportunity for there was obviously a lot of people quitting their jobs, and that's often, we often talk about like that was like some kind of massive problem. It is and it isn't. I mean, in large part, it's a good thing that a lot of people use that disruption to take a hard look at the job they were in, and they came to the conclusion that wasn't making them happy. And you know what? People should act when they make that kind of decision. So there was a lot of, underneath the surface, there was a lot of kind of positive reassortment of priorities and choices at the same time as there was this kind of pathological reaction.
Do you think we'll continue to see that evolve here as we start to get back to what some are referring to as the new normal, or people returning to office more frequently?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the fact that if we do, in fact, have a prolonged recession, I think the balance of power between employees and employers will shift. And, I have this company, audio company I started a couple years ago with, 4 years ago. We now have like 75 employees. And most of our employees are in their 20s or early 30s. They've never known economic hard times. They have no idea they've only known a job market where like everyone's competing for those services, which is like really weird to me because I'm old enough, as many of you are in this room, to have known several downturns.
Right.
And so they have such hilariously little anxiety about losing their job. And I cannot, I'm like, really? Like, do you not? It's just like, I mean, quite apart from other people outside, I've had conversations with people not in my company, and they quit a job and they don't have another one lined up. I'm like, whoa. That is
it is definitely a different way of thinking.
That is like, I don't know if that survives.
Yeah, no. Well, it's true. It's true. Well, and I think it translates to this next generation of investors too, right? Similarly, they've never seen a market, right, like we're seeing today. They don't understand inflation like we're seeing today. So as we, as this audience here, as we start to think that significant opportunity with this next generation of investors, I think of it a little bit as what you refer to as that tipping point, that tremendous opportunity. But again, not breaking your rule, but what advice do you have for us as we think about how do we start to understand that psychological mindset of this next generation of investor?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is what we've just been talking about, which is to a generation that has never known in any realistic way difficulty, right? So when we're already the pain has already started, of course, right? And the pain, when I see a 20% market drop, I'm like, all right, fine, whatever. If you've never had one before, it's scary, right? It's like really. So, it's really, really, really important, more important than ever, that someone who is of a younger generation have access to someone who has seen these things, who has some kind of longer-term historical perspective on what markets do, right? Now, the problem is that younger person may not understand the importance of the particular kind of expertise that comes from experience. And so the job is to explain that to them, right? Every young generation has a degree of kind of arrogance about their own knowledge, which is in part legit because they know stuff we don't know, right? But in other respects, it's a problem. In my little company that we started, we have one of our board members is someone who's like half a generation older than me and my co-founder. It is so crucial to have someone around like that who has just seen one more iteration worth of ups and downs than we have. But like I said, the job is to convince people of the importance of that kind of expertise. It's not always easy to do.
The value that experience brings to them. I like how you said that. I think you phrased it really well. The other piece I'm wondering if you could just elaborate maybe a little bit more too is as we've seen their careers aligning with the values or using the pandemic to align a little bit more with the values, We're also seeing that shift within their investment preferences, more value alignment on that. So do you have any insight into that you can share with us, how we see that carrying over and throughout their lives?
Yeah. I don't know. We're now into the area that I'm worried that someone in the audience is going to, with the German accent.
I'm close to the rule. I didn't go all the way over, I promise.
So I'm going to make a relatively trivial observation, which is just something I find weird. Not weird is the wrong word, but I'm not the first person to make this observation, but there is this thing that has happened, the kind of gamification of investing that's happened in the last generation, which troubles me a great deal, because there's the idea that it's almost like that trading stocks, for example, is a kind of play, and you can do that in an environment where stocks are always going up. And you can also do that if you think that you have an excess of money, that you can, like money is like monopoly money. It's that kind of thing. But you can't do that when times are really tough. And then getting people to move away from this notion that it's a kind of game, to getting people to understand, when you have 2 kids and a mortgage and bills are coming in and college tuition is looming, there's no game, right? These are the kinds of things that will keep you up at night, right? That's a very, very, if you're 26, it's really hard to put yourself in that mind frame. And I think that's another, that we have to somehow, I think, address the gamification that's happened over the last generation.
That's a really interesting point, and it has had a significant impact as we look at that next generation of investors. So I think that's something we can carry forward, and we'll continue to explore that over the course of the next couple of days. I could sit here for the rest of the night. I have tons of questions I could ask you, but Kirk is backstage, and I know they're anxious to get to the puppies. So I really want to thank you for being here with us tonight and sharing these insights and this information and in a way that's relatable, and we can bring it back to what we do and the clients that we serve. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back, Kirk Hewlett.
Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing from Malcolm Gladwell. My takeaways: in a high information society, trust is so important, and people are going to look for people they trust. That can be you, that can be us. And the language of values is so important in a high trust situation. Talking about values, which I think will be a lot about what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So we'll continue tonight's momentum with more valuable sessions and networking time for the next 2 days. So we're going to kick off tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. with breakfast in the ConnectEd Marketplace. Then we'll gather here in this room at 8:15 to hear from President and CEO Jamie Price and the advisor group leadership on exciting new initiatives that will add value to your business. And I would say, be here at 8:15. We're going to start right at 8:15. We have a special surprise to kick off that session. Until then, join us in the welcome reception right now in the Marketplace. We'll see you tomorrow.